I'm Barclay Shepard. I'm a member of the Lincoln Arts Festival, which is the parent organization of the Lincoln Festival Chorus. And we're very pleased to have Mr. Tony Antolini with us today, and he is the new director of the Lincoln Festival Chorus, which will be performing on the 17th and the 19th of August at the Congregational Church, and he'll tell you about the program. I'd like to introduce Miss Jeannie O'Connell, who is our Minister of Music at the Congregational Church and our choir director, who has also been involved with Lincoln Arts Festival over the years. So I'd like to turn it over to them now to talk about the program.
Thank you, Barclay. Tony, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your early musical life.
I was born in New York City in 1942, right in the middle of the war. My father was in the army in Italy, and I barely got to know him because he was there for a long time afterward as part of the Allied Control Commission. So I grew up in New York and was exposed to a lot of music there. My mother was in the advertising business. And after I graduated from high school, I went to Bowdoin College. So I have steady connection to Maine, even though I'm a New Yorker. My parents bought a beautiful home in Cushing, about an hour north of here on the St. George River, in 1937, before I was born. And so I had spent every summer of my life there. Even during the war, my mother would still take me there on the train. And so Maine is certainly not a foreign place to me. Then I went to Bowdoin. After Bowdoin, I went to Stanford University in California and stayed there for a long time because I pursued two different fields, which you can ask me about later if you're interested. After Stanford, I started teaching in Santa Cruz, California, and then a very lovely miracle happened. Bowdoin had a vacancy in my field, choral conducting, and I got to come back here. And I've been on the faculty at Bowdoin since 1991, so I am now finishing my 20th year as a choral director there, and next year will be my 50th reunion at Bowdoin, so this is a kind of a special time for me.
Have you got special events planned for that?
Well, I continue to conduct the chorus there, so I wouldn't call it a special celebration in itself, but the 50th reunion, of course, is a big deal. Mostly nostalgia stuff. The other thing that's happening this year as a kind of memorial recognition of something musical and old at Bowdoin is that when I was there, I was a member of the Medivemsters, which is, at the time, it was an augmented octet, 9 men. Now it's bigger. It's 15 or 16. And we are celebrating this fall our 75th anniversary. So because I worked there and because I was a Medivemster, I agreed to be co-chair of that event. So when we talk about things coming up this year, that's a biggie. That's going to be in October at the time of reunion homecoming. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, next June is my 50th, so there'll be something to do with that. But I'm not actually planning to retire. So, no, I'm not planning anything special musically. I just go on doing what I do.
Excellent. Did you have conducting teachers that were very influential for you?
Yes. My first conducting teacher didn't realize at the time that he was my conducting teacher. I was an undergraduate music major at Bowdoin, and he was a legend at Bowdoin. He retired when I left. His name was Fred Tillotson, Frederick Earl Thornley Tillotson, known as Tilly. And I was president of the Glee Club my senior year, and he had to teach me how to conduct because the president of the Glee Club conducts part of the concert. And when I look back at what he taught me, it wasn't so much technique as working with people. He was a model of how to motivate students to want to sing, and I still think of him in many connections. Then after that I went to Stanford and studied with a man whom I loved and admired very much, Harold Schmidt. And then as my career began to develop, I became more and more involved in Russian choral music. So the most powerful influence on my specialty conducting, which is Russian choral music, is a man who's still very vital in the Russian choral scene named Vladimir Minin, and I've studied with him and gotten to be friends with him. The other influence on my life is a wonderful German conductor, Helmut Rilling, and I went to Stuttgart and studied with him for a short while. So those are my heroes. The other hero who taught me technique is a woman who was a really very major force in American conducting, and that's Charlene Archibek, who's now retired, but she was at the San Jose State University, and she used to scare all of us to death because all of the conducting lessons were videotaped, and you had to do your thing and then sit there and watch it. And of course, you very often saw things that she would say, now, why do you do that? And then I would think to myself, I didn't do that, until she would show it to me.
Excellent. So you studied at Bowdoin, you studied at Stanford. Did you study overseas?
Yes, I studied briefly in Stuttgart in Germany, and then I had a grant to study at Moscow State University. That was more language oriented than music, although I did do music while I was there.
Maybe we'll have time to get back to your Russian background, but let's move on for a minute to what's happening here in Boothbay Harbor. Tell us about the repertoire that you're doing with the Lincoln Arts Festival Chorus this year.
It's by Handel, and it's a very interesting repertoire which is not well known. This is not, like last year the group performed the Mozart Requiem, which people recognize. This is not music so easily recognized, and I deliberately chose it for that reason, because my predecessor, Robert Russell, was conducting here for 18 years. And I think it's important when a new person comes on board that they do something distinctly different and go in a new direction, so that people don't always compare what used to happen with what's happening now. So I chose this repertoire with that in mind. The repertoire is called the Te Deum and Jubilate for the Peace of Utrecht. Now, I would like to give you a little historical background here, because not everybody watching would know what this is all about. It was written in 1712, so it's exactly 300 years old. And that's part of my interest in it. The Peace of Utrecht, which is a city in Holland, marked the first time in human history that a war was settled by diplomacy rather than a winning and a losing side. Now, the war in question was a ridiculous war called the War of the Spanish Succession, and all of Europe was involved in it, but it was basically, as usual, the French against the British. And the argument that started the war and continued the war was who would get to influence, who would be on the throne of Spain. And so the war was a war of attrition. It had gone on for over 10 years with no marked sign of ending and no winning and losing. It was just terrible loss of life and no particular gain to any of the parties involved. And so, fortunately for world history, the idea that maybe diplomats could sit down at a table and work this out was tried. And of course, these days, we assume that diplomacy is something that would be tried. But in that time, 300 years ago, it's interesting to think that it was a novel idea. And it worked. Well, Handel was living in England at the time. He was German, of course. And he wanted very much to make a career in England. He had decided that England was his future. And I believe that Handel was not only a brilliant composer and performer, but he was a very sharp businessman. And Handel saw, by reading the paper and talking to influential people, that there would be a very good chance that this peace treaty would be signed. And if it was signed, that there would be a celebration. And that's where he came in. So Handel reasoned that he would start writing celebratory music for a big church service in St. Paul's Cathedral. Now, St. Paul's Cathedral, believe it or not, was 5 years old at the time. And Handel, being the sociable guy that he was and the planner that he was, got to know the organist at St. Paul's. He got to know the Queen's doctor. Now, the Queen was Anne, and she was perennially very sickly. She was in bed almost all the time. So getting to know her doctor helped Handel to find out how she was doing and how long she would live. She died at the age of 39, believe it or not. But eventually, through the connection with her doctor, whom she trusted, she got to meet Handel, and he would come and play the harpsichord for her as she lay in her bed. So as he became friends with her, he said to her, if this peace treaty is signed, you will need celebration music, won't you? And she said, yes. And she said, you should write it. Well, of course, this was exactly what he needed, because the British have a law that any state occasion must be celebrated with music written by a citizen of the British Commonwealth. And he was German. And the only person who could change that was the Queen. So by edict, she could say, I want Handel to write this celebration music. And so with the snap of a finger, he became the composer of choice. And when they signed the treaty, he already had the music not only written but rehearsed. So she could say, it was actually in July of 1713, so 300 years from next year, there will be a celebration at St. Paul's, and there will be this music which George Frederick Handel has written. So that's the genesis of this. Now, there is also some very funny other politics behind this. First of all, Handel, being a German, was under the legal supervision of not a king, but in those days he was called an elector. And the Elector of Hanover was like his regent. But Queen Anne hated that man, absolutely hated that man. And when Handel was courting Queen Anne to become a court composer in England, the Elector, whose name was George, found out about it, and he was furious that Handel would jump ship like that. So then Queen Anne died, and they had a problem because the next king or queen, the next in line, according to the bloodline, was Roman Catholic. And in England, to this day, there is a law that says no Roman Catholic can be the king or the queen. So they had to search for the next in line who could become the king or queen of England. And just by interesting coincidence, it was George, the Elector of Hanover. And so he became George I. He then had to forgive Handel for becoming an English citizen, because he himself had to become King of England, and he was the only King of England who never learned English. His entire career, he spoke nothing but German and reigned from Germany. So that's the background to this music.
And how are you going to put that succinctly for this audience? Because
I can't put it succinctly. So what I did was write program notes, and I hope that the people who attend the concert will have enough interest to take the programs home with them and read this story, because it's like something these days that would appear on a talk show like this one, or in People magazine. Like people would say, that's stranger than fiction, and yet it's true. All of what I've said is factually provable.
It's factual, it's fun. Do we know why he wrote it in Latin?
It isn't in Latin.
It isn't.
No, it's in English.
Okay.
The titles are in Latin because those are the standard titles for these two particular texts. The Te Deum is a long medieval text that starts out, we praise thee, O God, we acknowledge thee to be the Lord. But it was very common to sing something like that in English in England at the time, especially at celebration occasions. The Jubilate is the 100th Psalm, O be joyful in the Lord, all ye lands, and it's all in English. And there's some...
The audience will have no problem understanding.
Well, I hope they'll have no problem understanding, but it's a big choir. It's most of it 5-part. There are 2 soprano parts. Mm-hmm. And so they're not all singing the same thing at the same time. So I've put the words in the program.
Right.
But it's very lively. There are 2 trumpets that play fanfares, and it's full of vigor.
So let's talk a little bit about why people will want to hear this music live.
Well, first of all, they get a chance to hear music that's a celebration of something I think we need very badly in our world, which is peace, and a peace solved by diplomacy. That's in itself worth hearing about. But the music itself is not only glorious from the choral perspective, but it will involve orchestra. We bring to the public this year a small orchestra called the Mozart Mentors Orchestra, which I started 2 years ago, and it's an unusual group because it's made up of string teachers from all over Maine, mostly Suzuki string teachers, but not all Suzuki. And they invite their most advanced students to play with them. So we have not a children's orchestra, not a youth orchestra, but a teacher and student orchestra. Then the other parts played by the trumpet players and the bassoonist are not part of this. They are professionals. But the strings are, you will see, a range in age from 12 years old up to people my age.
Fantastic. Very much in the Bowden tradition.
Yeah.
Or approximately how many people will be in the orchestra?
It's 26 players. A small orchestra, and then joining the orchestra will be a person who has been for a long time associated with this organization, Sean Fleming, the organist, and he will play organ with the orchestra, but also piano, because there is some light music in the middle of this, some pieces by the American composer Kirk Meacham. We will sing his setting of the 23rd Psalm, which actually doesn't involve Sean. It's for chorus and cello. And then we will do something called Birthdays in Round Numbers, which is a kind of rollicking nonsense set of pieces. They're musical birthday cards written for every 10 years. So we have a 10-year-old card and a 20 and so forth, all the way up through 70. So these are very silly pieces, and the audience will make sure to understand what the words are, because a person of each age group will step forward and read the poem aloud first, because they are in the form of rounds, canons, so the words are not immediately clear. And then Sean plays a very silly piano part with that. So it's not all heavy-duty stuff. Some of it is very fun, too.
Sounds like something for everyone.
That's right.
How many singers do you have this year?
Well, I would have to defer to Barclay about, I think it's about 60, isn't it?
Getting close.
It's getting close to 60 singers, and they are people who have sung here before with my predecessor. Some of them are summer people, some of them live here year-round, and then members of my 2 other choral organizations have been coming down and singing too. I conduct a group called the Bowden Chorus in Brunswick, and then I have a community chorus in Rockport called the Down East Singers. And Down East, it's about even. There are about half a dozen from Down East and half a dozen from Bowden who have come to join in this group.
And what are the age ranges, would you say?
In the
Lincoln group.
In the Lincoln Festival Chorus, I'm only guessing, but I see a very young lady there who looks like a young teenager, and we have some people in the group who are, I believe, in their 80s, but I don't want to presume to guess how old Barclay is, but I think he's over 80, but he doesn't act like it.
Some of those singers are the best singers.
Yes,
they come with
absolutely.
a great attitude.
Absolutely.
So you started Mozart Mentors Orchestra.
I did.
For the purpose of having an orchestra to go with your singers?
That's right. It all started really quite by accident. It wasn't originally my idea. There was a meeting that took place at St. Joseph's College in Standish. I teach every summer a summer school program called the New England Suzuki Institute. And my job is to teach sight reading and ear training, because the Suzuki program doesn't really include that. So I was sitting at a table in the dining room hiring the music teachers there to play in the upcoming season, string teachers, all of whom are much loved colleagues of mine. And one of them, the woman who started the New England Suzuki Institute years ago, Clorinda Noyes, said, what would be the chance that we could invite our most advanced students to play with us? That would augment the size of the group, and we could work on the music in lessons. And everybody at the table said, well, that's a novel idea, wonder if it would work. So we put together, this was in the summer of 2010, an experiment that we would see whether you could do such a thing. And it was so successful that first year we spent all year working on the Mozart Vespers. And in the spring we performed at Bowdoin with the Bowdoin Chorus, and the very same month with Down East Singers. It was a fantastic success. We had as the soprano soloist Suzanne Nance from Maine Public Radio. And Suzanne was a great help to us because she saw this orchestra and thought it was a wonderful idea. So she talked about it on the radio. She interviewed me on the radio and talked it up a lot. And she encouraged us to continue. So then the second season, we started working on other repertoire. And I began to push them very hard. The teachers said, this is great, let's see how far we can push them. So we decided on a piece that at first seemed insurmountable. It's a new piece, 2005, a Requiem by the Welsh composer Carl Jenkins. And Jenkins has written very demanding string parts. The dies irae is in a hip-hop rhythm, and they have to play it very fast with these sextuplets, very complicated. And the first time we rehearsed it, the students are looking, what happened? How are we supposed to do this? But they mastered it. And once they mastered it, their pride of being able to play something so not only technically demanding, but out of their own popular genre that they listen to with their iPods. I mean, it doesn't sound like hip-hop music, but it's derived from that kind of rhythm. It was hugely successful. And so then we kind of turned a corner and we started getting parents saying, how can my son or daughter start playing with this group? And students coming up to me saying, when are you holding auditions? Well, I don't hold auditions because I depend on the teachers to say, you're ready to play in this group. And in fact, one of the teachers who is a mentor is in this very area, Carol Preston, who teaches in Newcastle. Carol is a perfect example. She decides when some of her most advanced students are ready, and she's picked 2 for this fall who have never played with us before. Then they come once a month. We rehearse at Bowdoin, once a month for 2 hours. We go over all the music. The concert master, the first violinist, basically directs how the bowings and all of the technical stuff is going to work. Then they go back with their teachers and work on it. And the next month they come back and they play it again. And when it's ready, then we put it together with the singers, and we make really, I think, a much better sound that way. What the public hears when these kids play is something that's very well rehearsed. They're not just sight reading something they never saw before. They've been working on this for a year.
It sounds like this is going to be a very exciting series of 2 concerts
I think
this
so.
summer.
I think it's a must, really.
Do you have any sense of which concert, because the concert will be on Friday night and then it will be repeated on Sunday night.
Yes.
And sometimes audience members try to play the game of which night is going to be more exciting, which night is going to be better. Do you have a sense of?
That's
what
an
you think
interesting
people should do?
question. For me, it's impossible to predict which is going to be more exciting, because when you do two concerts, one is opening night and the other is closing night. And so I think it's important for everyone to recognize that they are at different times. I've had to work hard to remember this, and I hope I get it right now, that the Friday night concert is at 8 o'clock and the Sunday night concert is at 7 o'clock. And I don't want to go into the reasons why, because I really don't think that's of interest. But if people come on Friday night, they're going to see the excitement that always happens when a group of singers and a group of players have never performed for the public that particular piece in that place. And the second night, you get something where there is a kind of extra confidence because they know exactly what's going to happen.
They know they can do it.
Exactly.
It's going to be fun. Maybe people will need to come both nights to see the difference, hear the difference.
That would be just fine with me.
Great. So you obviously, we know you're a singer, we know you're a choral person. I'm sure that you're an organist.
Yes, I am.
And what other instruments do you play?
Well, I started with piano. When I was a kid, I was probably 4, with piano lessons. And I kept that up with piano all through high school, but I had become really quite an organ fan, and I was dying to start organ lessons, but the organist at the church where I went in New York was one of these very old-fashioned people who said, no organ lessons until you're absolutely fluent at piano. And so I waited until I got to Bowdoin, and then I started studying organ there. Organ has always been my favorite instrument, and I'm a church organist here. I'm the organist at St. John's Episcopal Church in Thomaston, where we have a lovely little tracker organ. But when people say to me, oh, you're an organist, I always say, well, that's really a secondary thing for me, because I have spent most of my life as a singer, as a choral singer, and then as a conductor, and that's where I put most of my professional time.
Any strings?
No, I have, that's why this experience with the Mozart Mentors Orchestra has been fascinating. I've learned more than anybody because I lean very heavily on our concert master, Dean Stein, who is a consummate violinist and also a wonderful teacher. So when we get into a score like this, Handel music, Dean will often stop and say, this is very important, by the way, for the conductor. He'll say, what are they singing here? And I sing it for them. And he said, well, we could do it this way or we could do it that way. Which would work best with the words? Now, that's worth $1 million right there, because so many orchestras come in at the last minute to work with singers, and that question has no time for discussion. You just play what you see.
Or change. It's hard to change at the last minute
Exactly.
sometimes. But this way, you're working all year to marry the two.
But I don't
parts.
play these instruments, but I'm learning how to speak the language by watching them. And it has really improved my understanding of the possibilities and what the problems are.
So you have this fantastic group of instrumentalists. Is Sean performing by himself? Is the orchestra performing anything by itself?
No, they don't play by themselves, and in this case, Sean doesn't play anything by himself. It's strictly in support of the singers. We've never actually played anything on our own except maybe an overture. But this group, the Mozart Mentors, is really not meant to be an orchestra for anything but supporting singers. And the kids who sign on have to recognize that they are not in something like Brunswick Regional Youth Orchestra, BRIO. One of our violinists now just got into the Boston Symphony Youth Orchestra. That's where she plays orchestral music. But the ones who want to do this are ones who want to accompany choral music. And so they select that. They can't say to me, oh, I wish we could play something by ourselves.
They
then
know
I
what
would
they're getting into before they start.
And the teachers tell them. So if they don't want to do that, they don't join.
And I bet that if you survey all the students who find that they're all in other orchestras and they're getting the
That's
orchestral experience somewhere else.
Yeah.
And that's fine.
Well, many of the teachers say it's very useful for my student to learn to accompany, because their role in this orchestra is very different from playing, let's say, a Mozart symphony, where they are the attraction. Mm-hmm. Here they must be in partnership with a group of singers, or they must accompany a soloist. And in the Handel, there are many solos, many duets and trios, so they have to learn how to balance the strings with 2 singers or 3 singers. Right. And that's a very important learning process for a string player.
Are your soloists coming from the chorus this year?
All.
All from the chorus this year?
Yes. I'm a big believer in that. I think that singers in a chorus should always have first refusal. Of course, with something like the Mozart Vespers, where it's written for an opera singer, and we had the chance to work with Suzanne Nance, that's something else. But these are soloists that were drawn from our group just as Handel did. He wrote it for people in his group.
And you have excellent singers, so
yes, we do.
It's great. Is there anything else you would like to add that people might find interesting, or encourage people to come see and hear this concert?
I think one of the things that's most important to just kind of wrap all of this up is to recognize that this kind of collaboration between string teachers and their students and choral singers is very unusual. I just recently submitted to a national magazine, the Choral Journal, an article about this, because I've discovered in comparing notes with people far and wide that this isn't happening. So if people are curious to see what this is like, they should realize that this is an experiment which has succeeded and is very unusual. It certainly has solved the problem of forming an orchestra to accompany choirs in Maine. Now, in a big city like Boston or New York, it probably isn't relevant. But when you think of the distances that we have here, and if you want to get a good orchestra together, people are all over the place. If the teachers can bring their own students with them, then you grow the size of the orchestra, and the people who come then to play are dedicated to working with singers. That's a real marriage made in heaven as far as I'm concerned. So people should see that.
Oh, I think it's a win-win-win situation. It's great for the string students who need more experience. It's great for the singers. It's great for Lincoln Arts Festival Chorus, which I believe this might be the first year that we'll be using an orchestra.
Well, it's been a while. It's been a while. One other thing that the listeners might find interesting, we pay everybody in this orchestra. This isn't just the string teachers. The students get paid, not as much. But we believe that if you have a young player and you say to that person, you are going to be treated like a professional here. You are like an apprentice in a business. And we are going to pay you, but you must be there on time, all the time. You must be prepared. You must know your music very thoroughly. You must be just as professional as your teacher. The pride that they have in being alongside an admired teacher, or maybe somebody else's teacher, is huge. So I asked these kids, why do you keep doing this? And they said, well, I am a professional. And that's very important. You know, it's not just, oh, you know, come help us out, because they really are valued. So I hope the people of this area will come and salute these kids. Our youngest player is 12, and she, I think, embodies the whole spirit of it, that it's a very tight ship.
You've convinced me.
Good.
It sounds like a concert that cannot be missed. So let's just review those dates. That's Friday, August 17th at 8 o'clock,
p.m.
and Sunday, August 19th at
7 p.m.
And they're both in the Congregational Church of Boothbay Harbor. How do people get tickets for this concert?
They, first of all, if they know anyone who's in the chorus, can get the tickets from singers in the Lincoln Arts Festival Chorus. It's also possible to get them by calling Lincoln Arts Festival 633-3913.
Right.
or Sherman's Bookstore, or the two chambers of commerce, Booth Bay and Booth Bay Harbor.
And the Silver Lining, a gift shop in town, a jewelry store in town.